I might have to jump up.
Welcome and Boker Tov or Erev Tov, wherever you happen to be right now. And of course, we'll start off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I'm going to go ahead and
Amen.
share the screen. And just a little bit of housekeeping from yesterday. So I went back, and it's chapter 11 of Genesis that talks about the generations of Noah. And I was looking to see where Aver was on that list. And it turns out that he would be Shem's great grandson, because we have Shem, and then we have let's see. Well, maybe hold on a second. No, because we have Shelach, whose son is the son of Shem, and there we go. Let me see. Yeah, okay, grandson. It is grandson. Shelach then gave birth or sired Aver. So Shem and Aver are grandfather and grandson. And as I said, there's this tradition that they started this yeshiva. So, but what we were talking about the last time was about how we were mentioning how Jacob had established the Ma'ariv prayer, and we had started looking at a Torah Temimah about that. And he had made a reference back to VaYera, where Abraham is the first one mentioned regarding establishing the daily prayers. And I felt this was an important topic to bring up because it's such a basic thing, and I think there's relatively little understanding about the traditions behind the prayers, and going beyond that, saying, well, what are we really trying to accomplish? What is it that the reason that we have the statutory prayer, and how deep does it really go, and what does it accomplish? So here we are now. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, it follows right after the angels visit Abraham and Sarah and talk about the future birth of Isaac. And then two of the angels head off towards Sodom and Gomorrah and those 5 cities because God is planning to destroy them. And here it talks about this is after everything had happened. This is actually the verse that talks about Lot's wife turning around and becoming a pillar of salt. And now we have Vayashkem Avraham. Abraham got up early, baboker, in the morning, Ela makom asher amad sham et pnei Hashem, to the place where he had stood and before God's presence. Okay. And he sees what's happening. He sees this column of smoke going up from that general area. So the destruction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Tzvoim, but not Zoar. So Tanya, again, the early source that's of Mishnaic, contemporary with the Mishnah, meaning prior to the year 200, but not included in the Mishnah. Avraham tiken Tephila Shacharit. There it is. Abraham established the morning prayer, the Tephila, and we know by Tephila we are talking about the Tephila, namely the Shemona Esrei. And how do we know this? Shenemar vayashkem Avraham baboker. Abraham got up early in the morning, El hamakom asher amad sham, to the place where he had stood, ve'ein amida ela Tephila. And we associate the Amidah, standing, with prayer, again because we have a verse that ties those two words together, Shnei Emar, and it says in Psalm 106, Vayamod Pinchas, and there we've got the Amidah, right? Pinchas stood, Vayipalel, right? There's a possibility that in the context there means, made judgment, but clearly it's still related to a word that is Tephila. It is referring to that word. And in fact, in the Art Scroll Siddur, there is an overview at the beginning of that Siddur, the daily Siddur, Art Scroll Siddur. That's a very wonderful piece to look at. And he talks about the fact that the word Tephila is related to the word to make judge. Plilim are judges, and that Tephila, lehitpalel, it's reflexive, means to judge yourself. And I think that's just an amazing way of looking at prayer, at the statutory prayer, that it's a time for reflection and that self-judgment is part of that. And as I play along with that and tease that idea out, I think to myself, well, it's all about trying to get in touch with who we are in the world. What is our place in the universe, right? How small we are, and at the same time, the significance of the fact that we even exist, and to allow those sorts of thoughts to generate deeper thoughts that the actual words of the prayer book help bring out. So here we are at Torah Temimah.
Can I ask one thing?
Of course. I'm
Thank
sorry.
you.
Go ahead.
About the word judgment.
Yes.
I'm thinking more of like waking up and becoming aware of the things, not only the things we want to change, but the things that we love, also with the protection of the prayers.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a lovely. I think that's a lovely way of understanding it, and I appreciate it because it adds to my own personal thoughts about what it means. And sort of, there's a very early prayer that we say in the Tefillot. That's one of the preliminary prayers where we basically say, we're not approaching you because of our own merits, and we say, what are we? What is our power? What is our wisdom, etc., etc., and compares and says, the mightiest of men have no power, the wisest have no judgment, etc., etc. Just to try and know our place, to really think carefully about what our place is in this world as we contemplate the majesty and the greatness of our Creator, and to recognize, to find a place like that.
Yeah,
Rabbi, it's really interesting that you keep using the word place
Yes,
when we are talking about hamakom.
right.
And when we are allowed to be in a service in a holy place, that we have our own usual special place that
Right.
we like to call. So I'm thinking that when you said, I'm like equating it with holy. You said like it's God yesterday. And I couldn't take any notes because I was somewhere else where I couldn't take any notes. But and I'm thinking it's your holy spot. It's where you feel closest to God or whatever. So it's all kind of pulling together. So every time you say place now, I'm thinking something totally different.
Cool.
Mhm.
I also, as you're discussing this, Golda, thinking about what does it mean exactly to have a place, right? And to understand that even that concept ties closely with significance. And not only that, there's the whole issue of to have a place is clearly a relationship. It's in relationship to other places.
Right.
That very sense of place has to do with knowing where you are relative to other things.
And that brings me back to what I wanted to say about what Lisa said, because judgment is the area that's just absolutely must have relative and has to be compared to something else, because you can't make any kind of, for instance, negative judgment without recognizing fully what's good and discerning.
Right.
So
yeah,
I like what Lisa said, because we keep thinking of judgment in the negative light, but you have to judge what's good, and you have to have full knowledge of both in order to be the perfect judge. But you can't just look, even God isn't just zeroing in on something negative. God sees the whole picture. And as far as the place, if God is hamakom and God is the entire place, then anything that we occupy, we're occupying God's place.
That's so you make a few different points here. So the first one, which is relevant relative to what Lisa said, I think is absolutely right, that you have to be able to make comparisons in order to, that's very much a part of judging honestly and truthfully. So there's judgments, of course, and we know that they're unfair judgments, and they're also judgments that run closer to the truth. And in order to do that, you have to have taken a lot of information and be able to compare that information all the way around. So that's part of it. And then the second point that you were making, Lauren, you'll have to refresh my memory on the point you were making there, but it was a different point that you were making. Forgive me.
The one connection between the 2 points is looking at the bigger picture, and to understand the smaller detail of a picture, you have to look at the context. So if God is the place, and that is like occupies all place, so any place that we have, whether it's geographical or attitudinal or whatever kind of place we have, is part of God's place that we're temporarily
Right
occupying.
now I know what I was going to say, and I think that's why you have the mystical concept of tzimtzum, right, of God contracting himself to allow place for the universe to come into existence, so that there's a sense that we may be created in the image of God, but we're not God, and that there's, even though God and part of God's oneness is expressed through what you were saying, Lauren, nevertheless there's also this idea of tzimtzum, and that it isn't just one unified, homogeneous, existence. Something that's, I think, fine. There's all these different ways of trying to think about it, because obviously we can only approximate reality and what might really be happening. And certainly I know for myself, have such a small amount of understanding about this whole thing. But nevertheless, there is that idea that we do stand relative to God, and that we're not in God in the sense that at least I'm hearing you. But on another level, I agree with you that there isn't anywhere where God isn't to be found. So it's just a matter of the limitations of our own understanding, but also to recognize we're capable of rebellion, and we can't say, well, God made me do it.
Right, but you don't have to look at it as God contracting to make room for us. You could look at it as God sharing the space with us. And if we are doing something that God doesn't like, it doesn't mean that God's not sharing that space.
Well, and in the prayers, it says, thank you, God, for granting me intelligence, or us intelligence. So what that does, once again, is I find that protection, that it's not just my intelligence, it's being granted to me. So yeah, so that's another connection.
Right. So the idea of contraction has to do with the very creation of the universe. That if there was nothing but the divine spirit, the physical world could not have come into existence. Nothing else would have been there. It would have been just one homogeneous existence that is God.
Or God shared the space and didn't have to contract.
So it's just another way of saying it, but the contraction is another way of putting it. We don't need to argue over metaphors, but it's just a different way of understanding it. Sharing has a different connotation, right? Which in some ways puts us on a closer level with God, and I think that's perhaps why that isn't the language that's used, but rather that idea of tzimtzum. So it's obviously we could spend a lot more time arguing over these different points.
Well, we're using place and space as a metaphor, and it's tricky because in actual physical space, only one thing can occupy a particular location at a time. So in physical space, I mean, that's how we.
But when you're talking about God, that's not necessarily, natural phenomena are not necessarily all the same when you're talking about God. I mean, God, is not a natural object or a natural phenomenon. God is something, transcendent and alternative and mystic and I don't think that that's necessarily true with God. It is true if you're talking about a marble and a pen, but if
Right,
God
right.
is one of those objects, I'm not positive that that's true.
Right, exactly. I mean, with the marble and a pen, we know where we stand. We know this principle that only one thing of that kind can be in a particular space at a time. But then when we try to use the metaphor of a physical space or makom and shift it over to discussion of God, sometimes it's kind of inspiring and interesting but it doesn't transfer perfectly because we're talking about a very different mode of being.
Yeah, that's why there's room for interpretation.
For sure. Another concept possibly worth adding to this conversation is talking about the divine as the ground of all being. In other words, all existence is grounded in the divine. Because if it weren't for the divine, nothing would exist at all. So, at any rate, let's see if we can plunge into this Torah Temimah, unless anybody feels they need to add anything else to this element of the conversation.
Yeah, I got just one little thing.
Sure.
Later on, which we may or may not get to in this parsha, Jacob says something that brings all of this home.
Yes, I think I know what you're referring to. Hopefully we'll get to it.
Yeah.
It's off to his vision. Well,
yes.
I'll take whatever time I can right now to look at this, and then regardless of how far we go with this today, I will go back into the parsha, please God, on Thursday. So he says, Nir'eh da'araya min vayamod Pinchas vayifalel hula adafa ba'alma. So what he's saying here, Torah Temimah is saying, is that it appears that this proof from the verse Pinchas stood and and prayed, let's just translate it that way, is really unnecessary. That it's redundant in a way. He's saying, Lo ra'at halashon amad. In order to, I think what he's saying here is to perhaps shed light, something like that, on the use of the language amad, the word to stand, deyunach al tefillah, which we're saying is a reference to praying. That to stand, we're identifying standing as praying. Mishum de be'emet, because as a matter of fact, he's saying that he's supporting his argument right now, right? That truthfully, miguf haf pasuk, from the verse itself where we're talking about Abraham, if you look at the context there, right? Mevu'ar de ha'amidah she'amad sham Avraham hayta tefillah. That in fact, that the fact that Abraham was standing there observing what was going on, that essentially, what was he doing? He was praying. That the context doesn't make any sense if that isn't what he was doing. Dechein mevuah parsha shesham titpalel al Sodom, because we know that is the place where he had argued with God and pleaded with God to spare the cities, and that certainly was an act of prayer. And the fact that it says here that this is where Abraham had stood before is already making reference to the fact that Abraham was praying there. So that's why the verse from Pinchas is simply there to show the connection linguistically, that there's two words appear in that one verse at the same time. V'hinei lekaman sof perek Chaye, and he says later on at the end of Chaye Sarah, right? That's that part about Yitzchak that Harlan mentioned yesterday. It appears the Yitzchak tiken tfilat mincha, that there we have the passage that talks about, at least the interpretation, that Isaac established the mincha prayer. Over Rosh Perek VaYetzei, this is our chapter, our parsha, and at the beginning of Parsha VaYetzei, the Yaakov Tikain Tfilat Arvit. That's exactly what we were talking about before this. Vesugya kan machloket, and in this particular sugya, that is to say in Brachot, page 26b, there is a machloket chachamim, there's a disagreement amongst the stages, im chayav tfilot etzleinu hu keneged tikunei avot kemevuar, whether the obligation for us to pray the Amidah, the way we do 3 times a day, is to correspond to the patriarchs the way we've explained, or, and this I mentioned yesterday, keneged korbanot tamidim tiknum, or did they establish these 3 prayers, these 3 daily prayers, to correspond to the offerings of the tamid offering, right, the daily sacrifice. Upasku haposkim, and the people who established the halacha, the poskim, kaman de'amar neged tamidim tiknum, that the decision is really and truly that the reason why we have these 3 prayers, Shacharit, Mincha, and Maariv, is to correspond to the tamidim, to the daily offerings. Kemuvu'ar b'Rambam, as the Rambam Maimonides explains, and he gives a reference, Perek Aleph, Halacha He Mitfilah. There's a chapter he talks about Tfilah, about prayer, and chapter 1, the 5th halacha of that chapter, the Chesef Mishneh. That's what the and Velechem Nishmeh. These are commentators on the Rambam. Tamhu, they were surprised. Al shehichriya kaman Amar ze neged hade'ah uchen neged avot tignum. Okay. So they're surprised that he made this particular decision, okay, and it's in opposition, that decision that that's the way it was, that it doesn't comport with the fact that these 3 prayers correspond to the fact that our ancestors, patriarchs, established them. V'li nir'eh dehachra'a zu, and this is Baruch Halevi Epstein saying that, in my opinion, okay, that this decision, this bending it towards the, I think towards the Tamidim, he alpi mashikatuv b'yoma, it has to do with what's written in the tractate Yoma, page 28b, Sluta de Avraham michi meshachre kotle. Okay, so let's see what we're saying here. So, Sluta de Avraham would mean the prayer, tzloton, the prayer, the supplications of Abraham, miki mishachre kotle. So this is, he got up early, right? He got up early. Kotel is actually, I'm trying to think how this is referring to. Forgive me. But I think it has to do with the fact that he got up so early in the morning. Okay, and this is some reference. I don't know what this is. I've forgotten what this particular abbreviation refers to. Okay, so anyway, okay, uparich beGemara, and the Gemara argues. V'chi anan me Avraham nekun v'nigmar. There's an argument that says, are we going to, in fact, derive this from Abraham? Upiresh Rashi, and Rashi explains there, V'chi me Avraham nagmir, should we be able to, in other words, are we to, in fact, derive all of this practice of the tefillot, okay, liot zrizim kamohu. So this is Meshachre Kotle, is referring to getting up so early in the morning. And he's saying, are we really going to be able to derive from Abraham that we have to get up so early like he did? Zariz means to have, the word is alacrity, right? That we have to gird ourselves up to do this. Aval hapuskim mefarshe kepirush ha'aruch, but in fact the people who determine the halacha explain like the aruch. The adain lo nitna Torah. Here's the reason why: that at the time of Abraham and the patriarchs, the Torah had not been given. The ein lalu lilmud ladin kavua, and for this reason, because the patriarchs preceded the actual giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, we cannot learn as an established practice miminhag avot, from simply what the patriarchs were doing. Ulefize yesh lomar, and because of this, we can say delachen bichru hatam, and this is why they chose the reason the keneged tamidim tikinum, that the sages established these three prayers like the tamidim, like the daily offerings. Mishum de ifshar likboa chova, because it isn't appropriate, one cannot establish an obligation, mishum takanat avot, simply on account of what our patriarchs established. And v'yein od, and he's giving you other references here, what's written, sof perech hayeh, v'rosh perech vaYetzei, saying, check what I wrote elsewhere in Chaye Sarah, where he talks about Isaac, and of course the part that we just read ourselves in vaYetzei, which is what we're doing here. So it's technical. I know that it got into very technical things, but I think it's still a sort of interesting point here as to on what basis we have established these three prayers, and the fact that they go this deeply into the whole idea. And I think, again, it's sort of interesting that we have these two different reasons for why we pray 3 times a day. And again, I think there are connotations that go along with how they are established on the basis of the tamidim, of the daily offerings, and also, on the other hand, how they're established on the basis of the patriarchs. Having said that, I would only add that the sacrifices themselves have the symbolism of the patriarchs that we have already done. I think you've already, together, we've already seen that some of the symbolism regarding the offerings has to do with a historical declaration that when they talk about the bull, they're talking about Abraham. When they're talking about the rams that were offered, they're talking about Isaac, and that's a clear connection. And when they're talking about the lambs, they're talking about Jacob. And then sometimes they're talking about, when they talk about a goat, they're referring to Joseph, because remember, the brothers, when they sold him, they took a goat and dipped its blood in the cloak and then showed it to their father. So that has to do with the sin offering, and then there are other offerings that refer to Moses and to Aaron. So it's interesting that we actually have a tradition that links both these two dynamics together. And I see that we are out of time. So I'm going to stop the share, and tomorrow we'll go, or rather on Thursday, we'll head on back into the parsha of VaYetzei itself. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, and thank those who are following us.